EA Sports. It's in the game. From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Jason Staples bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. Brought to you by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Good time to start looking at houses, by the way, right now. And if you are in Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky, give them a holler. Go ahead and get yourself the best mortgage loan originator you can in that space. All right, so we're going to do a sort of overview episode here. I'm getting ready to do my position by position walkthrough. Going to actually record them kind of in batch, several today, and then ideally several tomorrow, and then release those as they need to be released. But today I'm going to be looking at a few different things. First of all, just a more general thing, and that is I've not had time since this news dropped to discuss the new NCAA roster limits for the various sports. Now, this is exactly what kind of I expected. I mean, I'd said this, I think on this podcast and also, on social media and elsewhere, that this was really the only way forward was going to be going to NFL style, NBA style roster limits rather than scholarship limitations, along with, larger rosters allowed because of the NIL space and because of the fact of collectives and all of that, which essentially has been allowing for the complete skirting of scholarship regulations, of scholarship rules. And, it's one thing to have an 85 scholarship limit and then essentially unlimited, as many as your program wants, walk-ons beyond that. But once guys are getting paid by collectives or by others outside the university, it really doesn't matter, right? This is one of those things of the scholarship numbers always work out. Well, why? Well, because that guy doesn't necessarily need to be on scholarship. That guy could have his quote-unquote scholarship covered by the collective. And then in addition to whatever actual stipend essentially or pay that he's going to get from them. So that's where, it had basically become a joke in college football in particular that, okay, 85 scholarships, or this is where, Florida State gave up a few scholarships for the Alex Atkins, Amarius Mims situation. And it really didn't matter. Like that, those scholarship reductions don't really matter in a world where there's NIL. It just doesn't matter. And this became very obvious among the powers that be. And so the next thing that they had to do was, okay, well, if we can't cap scholarships and meaningfully make any difference, because essentially the programs that care are going to just have collectives that pay their players the equivalent of scholarships plus more, then the next step is moving away from scholarship numbers at all to roster numbers. And that's going to be a radical change for these programs. One thing that I'm kind of sad about, I mean, I was a walk-on. This effectively ends sort of the old traditional walk-on role that folks like me had. Now, whether that's actually a good thing or a bad thing is debatable. I mean, there's a sort of certain romance to it, to the kind of Rudy thing or and all of that, where you have a player who really isn't at the level to play in games. I mean, I was not a player that was at the level to be on the roster and play in games at a place like Florida State, but I still got the opportunity to practice and to be a part of that program and all of that as a walk-on. And I, gave it the old college try to get to be that kind of player and just never actually became that. Now the football roster limit is going from an 85 player scholarship limit, but now instead of being able to carry 120 players in season, now in spring and, even in camp, you can carry a lot more than that, but it's got to be 100. It's had to be 120, including walk-ons up to now. And if you've got 85 scholarship players and 120 players, well, you can do the math on how many walk-ons that actually is. Well, now they're cutting the overall roster limit down to 105. So that's going to mean 15 fewer guys who are like me. That's going to eliminate essentially that part of the game. Now, at lower levels, at your group of 5 level and all of that, that's where you're going to still see that kind of walk-on situation still feasible, because those programs are not going to be, they're not going to be paying 105 guys scholarship and beyond. There's going to be multiple players who are going to want to walk on and potentially earn a spot there that are not going to be on the books, essentially. But for a place like Florida State, for a place like Alabama, for Georgia, for the programs that care, that's going to be 105 spots that are already, the first 105 spots were walk-ons and preferred walk-ons. Many of those preferred walk-ons at this point are guys that are taken care of in some way. That's going to limit to those guys. So that's an interesting thing as things go. The other thing that really changes here and actually may have a bigger impact is some of these changes in other sports. I mean, baseball is going from 11.7. So, they had, for decades, baseball had basically 11.7 scholarships to be distributed usually in partial form across the various guys on that roster. Now they're capping a roster at 34. And again, baseball teams normally had over 40 players, and most of whom would be on, say, academic scholarship or not scholarship at all. And then a bunch of guys that, kind of split scholarships. But they had, a lot of these places like Florida State, had 40 players on their baseball team during the season. Now it's 34. So there's going to be 6 players per major program that are suddenly having to find new places, having to find new homes. And that's going to reduce the overall depth for those major programs. And at the same time, that 34 roster limit also presumes that, a large percentage of those guys can now be offered full scholarships or offered the equivalent thereof in terms of your major collectives. So the programs that have fully endowed scholarships across the board, that have major money, your Mississippi States, who are really big in baseball and have lots of resources from, SEC TV and all of that, those teams are going to be able to field 34 scholarships in baseball if they want to. I can tell you right now, at Florida State, fielding 34 scholarships in baseball is going to be an awful uphill climb. So that's going to be a major factor. And there are going to be, I think there are going to be some baseball teams, there are going to be universities that are going to decide baseball is not worth it. Softball also having a major roster change. Previously a scholarship limit of 12, now a roster limit of 25. Volleyball, roster limit of 18, previously 4.5 for men's teams and 12 for women's teams. This is going to get really expensive. And then if you get to revenue sharing and all of that, that starts to get really expensive, y'all. Really expensive. And that doesn't even get into sports like swimming. I mean, swimming is going from 9.9 scholarships previously available to men, 14 scholarships available to women, to a roster limit of 30. Now, that sounds like a lot, but the top programs all had more than 30 swimmers of male. And that, by the way, is swimming and diving combined. The top programs had more than that number. So the programs that are really competitive, there's going to be a lot of the swimmers who were previously not on full scholarship, which was most of them, by the way. But there are going to be a lot of those swimmers who are kind of on the margins at those places that are not going to be able to have a spot. There's going to be a lot of reshuffling. And the other thing is, if we're talking about 30 spots on the roster, how many of these are actually going to be funded by the university? How many of these are actually going to be scholarships? Because, I mean, that gets real expensive. How many of these are going to be paid for? And, which schools are going to want to pay that many? So a lot of these schools carried more than 30 swimmers and divers, male and female. So more than 60 total, or more than, 30 on one side or the other. But there's a lot of those programs that are not interested. A lot of schools are not interested in having 30 scholarships devoted to that. And then the question is, okay, which programs are going to want to do that? So now it's just a matter of, like, if Stanford decides that they want to offer 30 scholarships for men and for women in swimming and diving, and then nobody else really wants to offer all 30, they're going to basically win just by default, because they're just offering more scholarships. Because I'm telling you, place like Bowling Green is not going to be interested in having 60 swimmers and divers on full scholarship. Not going to happen. And a lot of places, I mean, even a Florida State, with the resources that they have, are they going to want to have 60 swimmers and divers on scholarship? Or are they going to say, okay, well, there's 30 roster spots, but we're going to, still limit to 12 total scholarships and offer partials and all of this, while teams in the Big Ten and the SEC, who have more resources, say, yeah, we're going to go 30 full scholarships. See how this works? This is going to get really, really interesting. And again, I think a lot of these schools are going to decide which programs, which sports they want to keep, which sports they want to, drop a level or two, or, transition to club teams, which sports they just want to eliminate. And I mean, I think there's a number of Division I schools that are going to drop football. They're going to drop a variety of different sports. They'll drop the ones that seem more expensive on that. So, yeah, it's going to be things are rapidly changing, and that even goes without getting into the grant of rights stuff, and we'll do some more updates on that once I've gotten a chance to get caught up. I'm not going to go off half cocked on that. I've got to catch up on some of those things to really be able to break down some of the things that have gone on in there. But yeah, we're in a brave new world here in terms of the larger context of college sports. Okay, moving into the second quarter of the show, and the second quarter is brought to you by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. Y'all know about Luis from listening to this show for years, but still the best in the business out in Jacksonville. If you want professional photography, videography, drone footage, all of that stuff of your house to get it sold out in that greater Jacksonville area, nobody's better than Luis. Best in the business. Let him know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast. Also, really good if you want a seller's agent. But if you want to list your house, he's the one I'd choose. Let him know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast. All that information is in the show notes. So moving into the second part of the podcast, I want to get into a couple things before we get into position previews and all of that. Get into a couple things that are just general about where things are at this point in camp and going into the season. First of all, I think it's important to reiterate, and I'll reiterate this one more time also in my wide receiver preview, but you got to remember, and this is a hobby horse. Those of you who've listened to this program for a long time know that you know what I'm going to say when it comes to young wide receivers. Florida State has done a very good job of landing some high quality young receivers that now that cupboard is now much fuller than it has been in terms of young talent than it's been in a while. You look at guys like LaWayne McCoy, Camden Fryer, BJ Gibson. They were here in the spring, all looked solid. And then you add Elijah Moore, and he looks like a dude, man. So now all of a sudden, everybody's excited, and you start to hear the practice reports or the things coming out of the summer out of summer workouts about how good this guy looks and he's making some big plays and all of that. And then inevitably, everybody's always disappointed when that guy doesn't play as much during the season as a freshman. And maybe even as a sophomore, he's not quite ready. And then folks start to wonder, like, why aren't our more talented wide receivers out there? Y'all, just apply this general rule of thumb. If Florida State signs a top-level wide receiver, even a 5-star wide receiver, just situate your expectations for his freshman year as minimal. It's a very difficult position to come in and play in college. The transition from college or from high school to college at wide receiver is enormous. And the reason for that is if you are such a good athlete, if you're the kind of athlete that is a 5-star level wide receiver in high school, you can basically do whatever you want just by virtue of being that athletic. You're a freak. And odds of you going against someone else who's similarly a freak in high school are very slim. And if you ever do, it's like 1 or 2 games during a year. And there's so few other players out there like that you're still able to do stuff. And then you get to college, and all of a sudden you have to learn technique. All of a sudden you have to learn how to get off coverage. All of a sudden you have to learn how to read coverage. All of a sudden you have to learn route adjustments. All of a sudden you have to do all of these other things. And it goes from being a position that is just about being able to moss guys and being a freak athlete to being a position that is a highly technical position. It's one of the more technical positions in football. And it's one of those positions where if you don't have the fundamentals right, you can cost your team about as much as anybody, because if you're in the wrong spot or if a ball goes through your hands, all of a sudden that's a pick. Turnovers are really important. A dropped ball goes from a first down to punting, or goes through your hands, might be a pick six. So this is the tricky thing. You're basically recruiting guys who pretty much inevitably in high school got by being bigger, faster, and stronger than everybody else, and now they have to play a technical position. In that respect, it's pretty similar to offensive line, with the difference that on the offensive line, being bigger, stronger than your opponents in high school is what you're gonna have, and then you have to learn to play a technical position in college, and also the difference between bigger and stronger at high school and being grown man in college is different. So the transition on the offensive line is even harder. But this is where, again, I've seen some folks and I've gotten some questions about this, what to expect from a guy like Elijah Moore or LaWayne McCoy, some of those guys. And basically my expectation for them is pretty minimal. And you should have similar expectations for this year. And the same is going to apply to a guy like Hakeem Williams. Like, why hasn't he broken out? Well, first of all, he got dinged up. Second of all, he was raw. Like, he was a 5-star, not because of his technique. He was a 5-star because he's a freak. And he had further to go in terms of the wide receiver position than most 5-stars. And everybody knew that coming in. So it's going to take him a while. And now it's starting to click, but how quickly does it click? It's going to differ for everybody. But this gets back to, you remember when there were all sorts of people in the Florida State beat who constantly harped on Jimbo Fisher and not having wide receivers play early, and how, they have to learn the whole route tree and everything else. Well, guess what? In every, and I saw recently another Florida State report that was referring to, with these young receivers, Florida State does run kind of a complex, Mike Norvell's system does have its complexities. Yeah, guess what? It's a real college offense. This is not the Gulf Coast offense. If you're going to run a real college offense, it's going to be hard to contribute as a freshman wide receiver. That just is what it is. And the good thing is that Florida State has a bunch of seniors as well. They've got Kentron Poitier. They've got Ja'Kai Douglas, Malik Benson, Darion Williamson, Deuce Spann. That's 5 senior wide receivers in this group. to go with all of that young talent. So they're in a position where the youngsters can come in and contribute as they're ready, while the older guys can be, can ideally be out there and be more consistent and handle the technique correctly. So we'll get to that. We'll get to more of that in the wide receiver preview, but that's something just to address because, I've seen some questions about that lately and figured that should be dealt with in the preview. Now, moving into the third quarter of the show, this quarter brought to you by Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. Recently designated the #1 realtor in the Chapel Hill area by Chapel Hill Magazine, has earned all of that. If you want somebody who's going to do PhD level research to make sure that your home looks the best, give Shenandoah a call. Let her know you heard about her from the Unconquered podcast. So for the third quarter, I'm going to actually reheat a couple of older questions that I've gotten that I think apply to this particular preview season as well. This question goes back to 2018. What position groups do you expect the biggest improvement from, and the individual in each group that improves the most? And I'm also going to go with position groups that maybe I don't expect as much improvement from, but just in general. And again, we're going to do more detailed individual position previews here soon. But when I look at this team, the place that I expected the biggest improvement is on the interior of the offensive line and the offensive line in general. I think the offensive line is the strength of this team. And last year, it was not the strength of that team. They had to compensate for a lot of leakage at times in that offensive line. And when we get to the preview on that, we'll get into some of the numbers on that. But I think they basically can go 9-10 deep with top tier ACC level players this year. And they're going to be able to rotate, and they're going to have guys that can block without giving up a ton of penetration. That can hold up. And that's going to be huge. Again, one of the things that they're going to depend on this year is a higher success rate from the running game. They're going to get fewer splash plays, I think, than they got from Benson. But I think they're going to have a lot less leakage, a lot less penetration in the backfield than they had last year. And so you're going to get guys to that second level for, chunk 6, 7, 10, 12-yard plays a lot more frequently this year. Now, that's against the bulk of the schedule. There are going to be a few teams, and we'll talk about that in our season previews and in the schedule previews. There are a few teams that are going to challenge that, and that's where really this team is going to have to make the leap. But against the normal teams on this schedule, I think this team's going to be able to basically pound the rock and win football games because they're going to be very solid up front with some running backs that can do damage between the tackles. Beyond that, on the defensive side, the position group that I think improves the most, it's a good question, but I think, boy, that's hard because I think last year's defense had so much quality that it's going to be hard to improve on. I think the depth at edge is going to be the biggest improvement. I think beyond that, it's just a matter of trying to maintain that level. So I think the depth on the edge is going to be better. Beyond that, I don't think the defense necessarily improves beyond what they had. I think maybe a little bit better at linebacker against the run in certain contexts. But we'll see. We'll see. All right. Next question there. This goes back to last September, and I answered this question on the air as I did with the prior question back in 2018. But in last September, I got this question from Prince Bowie. Do we have slot receivers, Destin or Wright? What's the deal? Well, that gets into something that is going to be immediately evident in how I break down some of the position groups this year. The slot receiver at Florida State this year is a position that I think is going to be minimized. It was last year to some degree as well. But I think I think this team is going to be a lot of 21 and 12 personnel. So either two tights or two backs. And I think it's mostly going to be two backs. I think you're going to see a lot of Roydell Williams and Lawrence Toafili on the field at the same time. You're going to see Lawrence Toafili and Jalen Lucas on the field at the same time. You're going to see Jalen Lucas and Keziah Holmes on at the same time. You're going to see, Toafili and Keziah Holmes on at the same time. You're going to get a lot of different formations with two backs, a lot more than what we've seen in the past. And that's because that's really where the strength of this team is. They've got 7 guys listed at tailback or running back, the 3 and the 4 positions as they are marked out in Norvell's nomenclature, that are among the best skill position players you have. And if you start looking at what the potential weaknesses of this team are, one of the things that keeps coming up is who's going to be the difference makers at wide receiver. Do you really have the guys that scare teams at wide receiver? And yeah, they're going to have 3 receivers, sometimes 4 receivers on the field at a time. But more often than not, they're going to have a guy like Toafili line up in the backfield and then split out and become a slot receiver. Or even more likely with that, somebody like Jalen Lucas do that. Where all of a sudden you're getting a speed merchant lined up on somebody who has to treat him as though you're forcing defenses to match personnel for your backs and then have to cover a back who's really more of a wide receiver in that situation. So that's one of the things that we're going to see. And I think otherwise you're going to see a lot of 2 tights, 1 back. I think there's going to be times where you're going to see 2 tights, 2 backs. So 1 true wide receiver out there with 2 tights and 2 backs. And then all of a sudden you're going to line up one tight end flexed, 1 running back is going to spread out wide. And now you've got 1 back and one quarterback in the backfield. And you're in a 4 wide receiver type set, or a 3 wide receiver with an attached tight end or a sniffer, somebody in the backfield, an H-back. You're going to have something like that, but the personnel is going to be bigger personnel. Because, and this is something that Norvell really likes to do. This is something that goes back to when he got hired at Florida State. This is what I said to expect, is he's a guy who loves to use versatile personnel. He likes to have personnel that he can line up in 5 different formations. He can go big or he can spread you out with the same personnel. And here's the other thing. In terms of short yardage, DJ Uiagalelei is basically another big back. And because you feel good about your backup with Glenn, you actually are not as hesitant to let Uiagalelei get the 3rd and 2 with the run. Partly also because, he's enormous and is not as likely to get hurt. So, in that context. So that's something else that I think, as we're addressing some of the questions that have come in, and I'm revisiting some old questions to discuss for what is relevant for coming into this season. These are things to think about in terms of what to expect from this team. Actually, as I've been thinking about it, one other thing that I want to add in terms of defensively, I think the other thing that actually is going to improve is that second safety spot, where last year, particularly when Akeem Dent was not healthy, that was not the strongest spot. And, last year they had Kevin Knowles playing out of position a good bit at that field safety spot. And that was not ideal. And this year, I think they've got 3 guys on the roster that are better than what Knowles was at that position last year. And that's just because, again, the guy was playing out of position and he was banged up. And this year, now Knowles goes back to a more natural position where he can play nickel, and he's basically backing up Earl Little there. But he's another guy that can come on and be a slot defender and be a reliable one and take some snaps there and be a good player at that spot where he's been a good player before. So I do think the safety position is one, on the defense, I think the safety position is one place where they're going to be better than they were last year. Okay, 4th quarter. Here we go. So, in 4th quarter, brought to you by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. Look, you want to be the envy of your neighborhood and make sure that your garage, when you open that up, is fully organized, actually fully functional, not just a complete mess. Give Nathan a call down at Garage Makeovers. And when you do, make sure you let him know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast. Information in the show notes. So for the 4th quarter of this show, for the 4th segment, I want to talk a little bit about a few other things, changes from that have been notable from camp, things that should give some optimism, things that maybe are reason for pessimism, that sort of thing. First thing I want to point out, I was actually at North Carolina's preseason, one of their preseason practices earlier this week, and one of the things that stood out to me was just the difference in practice tempo that having the various support staffers, your analysts and everybody else actually allowed to coach openly in your practice, how much of a difference that makes. And that reports from the Florida State practices are the same on that. And I think all of the programs that have, amassed significant support staffs, you're going to see that difference. One of the things that's going to mean is I think you're going to have an overall higher level of play, especially earlier in the season, than what we've seen in college football in recent years. I do think that is going to have some impact. There's going to be fewer big mistakes. Certain guys are going to be ready a little bit faster than they would have been in terms of technique and that sort of thing, because they're getting more individualized attention. And so that's something to keep in mind. When you have a young guy that needs to get ready, and you've got a support staff where you can have one guy completely devoted to making sure that the freshmen are coached up additionally between reps, while the main position coach is working on other stuff with the whole group. That's enormous. You can split your offensive line down into smaller units and have individualized attention on specific things by the various staffers that are all on the same page. Now, what that means is that the head coach and the coordinators and the actual coaches on the staff have to be that much more organized, and they have to communicate with all of the rest of that staff to make sure that everybody is absolutely on the same page. So in some sense, that makes things a little bit more difficult, and I think it does advantage the better organized coaches. And that's one thing that we know is a major strength of somebody like Mike Norvell. So that's something to keep in mind as we're coming into the season, is that I do think the individualized attention and the higher tempo permitted by having more hands on deck in terms of coaches. And if you just think about it from a teaching perspective, it's like reducing the student to teacher ratio in the classroom. And if you go from a 40-1 to a 10-1 ratio, the students are probably going to learn better. There's a reason people pay a lot more money for smaller class sizes. So that's something to keep in mind here. Now, a few things that I think are real positives coming in so far. Number one is Robert Scott actually being healthy enough to be competitive, to compete for a job. That's maybe the most important piece of news so far out of camp. Because Robert Scott is an all ACC level player when he's healthy. And now all of a sudden you go from being pretty tenuous at the tackle position in terms of you got to make sure that those guys stay healthy and it's a long, long season, to being able to rotate. Robert Scott can play both left and right. And you can suddenly rotate three guys that you know are top level players at that position. And Byers, as excellent a run blocker as he is, he's the best run blocker on this team. He struggled at times in protection last year. You look at the Clemson game, that was a tough game for him. If he starts to struggle like that, you can put Scott out there, and Scott, a little bit better pass blocker in the past. So maybe you platoon a little bit depending on matchup if you need to down the stretch. But that gives them some security at the tackle position. And then you look at Andre Otto coming on as well, and Jalen Early coming on, and those guys being much closer to being dependable at the, ready to actually contribute this year. That's huge. Huge. Florida State has not had this much depth in terms of quality bodies at tackle in a decade. And, that's huge. Beyond that, looking at, the interior is kind of what we expected, what we saw in the spring. Having Rizzi on the roster as someone else who's a reliable snapper and looks like he's taking to things well. That's another guy that, again, makes you deeper. And I'm of the view that this year on the offensive line, especially with the way they're going to run the football and the physicality that they're going to bring to the table, look, if they can platoon, if they can get to where second half, fourth quarters, those sorts of things, the starters aren't playing and the second unit is playing much more. And if they're rotating, we saw how Keandre Jones rotated at guard last year a bunch as they platooned those guys. If they can do that at all of those positions, at essentially center, you can't really do that. But basically once they get up enough, then you make the sub out for your center. But beyond that, if they can just rotate bodies, that's going to make them much, much better in the second half of the season, and also make sure that those guys are healthier and less likely to get hurt. So that's one of the bigger things that should be a cause for optimism coming out of camp. Another thing that's cause for optimism is DJU has, I think, taken a big step for what they want in this offense. He seems to have command. Again, if you've got a guy who we saw last year at Oregon State, he did a great job of avoiding sacks and avoiding turnovers, just negative plays. And if he can be a guy who just avoids negative plays and then 3 or 4 times a game puts a ball in a place where it's a potential big play, then this becomes a really dangerous football team because they're going to be able to run the football on a lot of teams. Third thing, major cause for optimism here, is Cam Riley. I think Cam Riley, first of all, you watch him move, and he's like that guy moves differently than the other guys his size at that position. Well, first of all, they don't have anybody else really his size at that position, but he moves. And I think he brings a dimension to this defense at 235 pounds and moving the way he does with his length. He brings a dimension to this defense that makes it real interesting. And the young linebackers, Nicholson, Cryer, to a lesser extent Murphy, who, I think is really, it's going to take a while for him, I think. But those guys, the step forward, again, if you can rotate a little bit at that position, that's all very helpful. And I think the other thing that is a major cause for optimism is KJ Sampson taking a step forward at nose tackle. If he actually comes in and basically gets himself into the rotation where he's in the top 4 this year, my main concerns about this defense, and I said it in the spring, I said it in the summer, my primary concern about this defense coming into this year is I've felt like they were basically one big body away from what they needed to have on the interior at defensive tackle. If KJ Sampson's ready a half a year or a year early, and he's flashed in the past, but if he's ready to really be that guy, this defense suddenly becomes that much better, that much more dangerous. You'd still like to have one more. I mean, Lyons is a good player, but you'd love to have one more 315-pound type that you can stick out there against the teams that want to, pound the ball. But I'm starting to look at that depth chart at tackle, defensive tackle, a little bit more optimistically, because you already know what you got in Farmer. Darrell Jackson is a top-tier athlete. And then if you can have Sampson and Lyons there, and then Tomiwa, Durojaye, and Grady Kelly as your 5 and 6, now you've got 6 guys that that can play at this level. And now you've got guys that you can rotate. Because again, it's going to be critical that they are able to rotate. And the more they can rotate against teams that they're beating, the better. You want to rotate less in the 4 games this year that are most concerning. You want to make sure that you can maximize the reps and the freshness for those big 4, as I would call them. And, basically you hope to be able to rotate through the remainder of your schedule. And if you can do that, then you can go into the playoff with a healthy roster, which is what they would have done last year. So really optimistic stuff there. Now, in terms of pessimism, aside from one particular player that, missed some time early on, there's really not a whole lot. You knock on wood that they stay healthy, but this team is what it is. And it's going to be a different team from last year, but it's going to be a dangerous team and a team that I think I think has lower upside, in a play-to-play basis, but on both sides of the ball, I think might have a little bit more overall consistency. I can't say on both sides. The defense last year was so consistent, with the exception of the safety position when they had some trouble there at different points. But they might have fewer overall weaknesses that could be picked on either side than last year. Now, that doesn't necessarily win you games against the elite teams, because at that level, it's not just a matter of can you not have weaknesses. It's a matter of what strengths do you have. You start to get away from taking advantage of weaknesses, or teams taking advantage of your weaknesses, to being able to flex your strength over and against even their strengths. And I think this team may have a little bit less of that, but it's going to be really interesting. Anyway, that's going to do it for us here for this sort of catching up to camp preview. The next things that I'm going to be releasing are going to be position by position, which I'm getting to right now. I'm going to release those independently. But until then, this has been the Unconquered Podcast with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media, and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Louis Marquez of Keller Williams Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.